Hello, everyone. Simon Jacobson here. We will be speaking about a very critical and important issue, and I have a very special guest that I will introduce to you shortly. The topic is about intimacy and sexuality. You know, we are living in a time of a crisis of intimacy, which has a direct impact and consequences on virtually every part of our lives, our marriages, our families, our children, and above all, it's generational, because our attitude to sexuality is going to impact everyone around us, and how our children, as they grow up and become adults and marry and build their families, how they will approach it. So we all know that intimacy or sexuality is perhaps the most potent and powerful force in human life. On one hand, it brings the deepest levels of love, connection, companionship, and according to the Torah and a sacred marriage, this is how we give birth to children. The only way to bring new life into this world is through intimacy. On the other hand, we also know about sexual addictions and the power it holds over people and can distort and can be corrupted and polluted and create great damage, both to ourselves and to others. When you throw into the equation sexual abuse, obviously, that has deep implications as well. So, what a more important topic, one of the most important topics to speak about. And I have a very special guest who is an expert on this topic. So we're titling this conversation, Educating Our Children with Healthy Intimacy and Sexuality in Our Challenging World. Ancient wisdom for modern times. And our special guest is Dr. Yocheved Debow, an author of a very important book talking about intimacy and sexuality, a guide, a traditional guide, I should say, for the Jewish parent. And let me give a little background, Dr. Debow. Dr. Debow holds a doctorate from Bar-Ilan University School of Education. Her research focuses on sexuality and intimacy education in the modern Orthodox community. She has published Life Values and Intimacy Education, Health Education for the Jewish School, grades 3 to 8. In addition, she has authored a Life Values and Intimacy curriculum for Jewish high schools, which is currently in use in day schools across North America, United Kingdom, Australia, and in Israel. Dr. Debow holds an MA in child clinical and school psychology and a BA in psychology and education, both from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She speaks about various areas of Judaism and parenting, talking to children about sexuality and raising Orthodox children in a remarkably unorthodox world. Dr. Debow resides in Alon Shavut, Israel, with her husband, Rabbi David Debow, and they have 6 children. So welcome, Dr. Debow, Dr. Yocheved. It's a real honor and pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor for me and an opportunity to be able to share thoughts about educating our children in areas of, as you say, sexuality and intimacy, which is such an important holy topic in a world that makes it so unholy. So thank you so much for hosting me.
May I ask you, let's just start out, how did you get into this field in the first place? Like, what motivated you?
I was a middle school principal in a school in Cleveland called Fuchs Mizrahi School. And as happens in so many schools, there's one class across education, or at least they used to be, where the school educates young women about puberty. And it was done in a way that I wasn't so excited about. And the truth is, actually, what I should really give credit to, there's also an initiative in the school, a community of educators who wanted to make sure that there was healthy sexuality education. And they took an initiative to create something that I was then able to take and make into a curriculum. So it came from being a middle school principal in a community that was already thinking forward ahead of themselves and wanted to make sure. Actually, a woman by the name of Mickey Reeder was the person who spearheaded the project, and I sort of took it on and made it much bigger, and then ended up doing a doctorate and sort of making this my life's work, or some of my life's work.
Yeah, well, I can speak from my experience. in dealing with many different people, it always comes down to when people talk about their struggles in marriage or even their personal demons, somewhere there's always going to be a lurking element connected to sexuality and intimacy, usually of the unhealthy sort, where the people experienced in childhood a violation of boundaries, or worse, molestations, or in general, an attitude that was not really healthy. And you literally, almost every situation you can trace to something in that field, that when you can have a healthy intimacy, sexuality, it affects your own well-being, your own peace of mind. And for some reason, and the reason according to the Torah is that intimacy and sexuality is so deeply wired within us that when something is not working well in that area, it has effects that affect every part of us. You know, you get a scratch on your finger, it's a superficial wound. But if you get a scratch in that intimate part of our lives, it's in a way permanent. It can be dealt with. I just wanted to know your take. How do you see that as in context of things?
So look, I definitely agree with you. The Torah teaches us that there is no deeper connection between two people than an intimate connection that is emotional, right? In Breshit, which really takes us back to the beginning of human relationships, the Torah says that the relationship between a man and a woman, between a husband and a wife, has two aspects. V'davak be'ishto v'hayu basar echad, right? So v'hayu basar echad is sort of the sexual, intimate, physiological side of that connection. And v'davak be'ishto, davak, which comes the root vekos, is an emotional, spiritual connection. So that the ultimate connection between two people is that body and soul, which we know HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us both body and soul, and they're both important parts of ourselves. So by definition, when it goes wrong, it affects both our body and our soul. And exactly as you say, it becomes so deeply ingrained in us that when it's good, it's wonderful, and when it's bad, it's deeply destructive.
Okay, so then when dealing with it and just going beyond the so-called the psychology and philosophy, but on a practical level, it seems that in this dealing, since everybody, like they say, you cannot live without sexuality, and some people find it very difficult to live with it, but we know the Torah not only sanctions and condones, it's actually this most sacred thing people can do, is, as you said, to become one flesh in a sacred way, where male and female, man and woman, unite with God, who created the human being in the divine image. But in dealing with the challenges, it seems that one thing is preventive medicine. What can we do to make sure that we and our children and everyone around us has the right healthy attitudes and behaviors? At the same time, how do you deal with problems once they exist? How do you so-called heal? How do you repair? How do you improve? So I'd like to really talk about both things, but maybe we can begin, though we're going to definitely speak about how to speak to our children, educate our children. But let's begin with the adults, since the children, we hope for the good, but sometimes it's not always for the best. The children are influenced by our parents. So how would you, if you were able to frame a few key points that you would say needs to be the right mindset and heart set and soul set of every adult, because every adult who's in a relationship, obviously intimacy is a big part of it. How would you contextualize what would be considered healthy intimacy, and in contrast to something that would be not healthy? How would you structure that?
Okay, so I'm going to go back to the Torah. I'm going to stay in Breshit because I think we get a lot of messages from the story the Torah tells us about how humans are created and the relationship between them. And let's come up with a couple of tips just from the Pshat of the Psukim. We start with the idea that a human being is created b'tzelem Elokim, right? That we're both, let's try and sort of unpack that. What does it mean to be created in the image of Hashem? So I think when we're talking about sexuality, for me, it actually is exactly as we just said, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Perek Aleph kind of creates a very physical world, and that which is spiritual is very separated. The only creature that's created where HaKadosh Baruch Hu breathes a piece of himself into that physical creature is the human being. So the only creature on earth that is both physical and spiritual is the human being, right? So that's piece number one, the idea that we're both physical and spiritual, which if we want to talk about a challenging world, I think we don't That's not necessarily a message that we get in this world nowadays, right? It's do what you want, what you feel like, think about your physicality and what is good for you. And the idea that we have a soul and that's combined and connected is an ancient idea that isn't always passed on in the modern world. So that's message number one. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes that human being who he's created and places him in Gan Eden. And the very first place in the Torah where the word sivui, the word commandment, is used, is when Hashem turns to Adam and says, Mikol eitz hagan achol tochel. I want you to eat everything that's in the garden, right? All the trees that you see in front of you, I want you to enjoy them. So the idea that I think is also a Torah idea is that the fact that we're physical beings is not a b'diavad. It's not, in Judaism, we don't believe in trying to deny our physical selves. HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates the world to enjoy it, and right away after that says, but there's one tree you mustn't eat from. Okay, so the idea that we need to enjoy the physical world, but according to the rules that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us, that there has to be some kind of boundaries, that there has to be some kind of rules that we follow in general, and even in this area of sexuality, and that's part of how it's kadosh, sacred. Right? What makes a Jewish marriage relationship sacred? For me, the word kadosh, I understand it as being because we each, when we commit to marriage, we say, I am yours and you are mine exclusively. Right? That's kedusha, that we set ourselves aside and say this relationship is a relationship just between the two of us. That's intimacy. Intimacy is the point where you have something that is yours that no one else is allowed into, right? That it's private, that I don't share it with anyone else anymore because it's so special that I want to keep it special. So that idea of kedusha is that idea of separateness, of it's just me and you together, and we're going to create something intimate between us. So that's another message of the Torah. And again, I think one of the great chidushim, one of the things that Judaism brought to the world, certainly within ancient religions, is the idea that sexuality can be holy, can be precious, can be beautiful, is special, as you said. Perhaps something that's sometimes hard to understand is that the reason that we're so strict about sexuality and who we allow ourselves to be intimate with or even to touch is because we see it as something so beautiful and powerful that we want to save it for a very particular space. And that's part of how it remains beautiful and powerful. And so we come back to the pasuk, which is the ultimate relationship is a relationship that combines our physicality and our spirituality, our dveikos, our connection to our deep side of ourselves, along with our physicality, and that they feed each other. And when we do make sense that the only creature that is both body and soul, their deepest relationships need to be relationships that impact or that include both their body and their soul. And that's really sort of the primary message that the Torah gives us about healthy sexuality. It's exclusive, it's deep, it's both communication on an emotional level, on a spiritual level, and on a physical sexual level. And when that's all combined, that's the ultimate connection in a healthy space.
Yeah, example I use often in discussing this and seconding what you said in my book, Toward a Meaningful Life, I have a chapter on intimacy. And use the example of like when you're intimate with a person in a sacred context, you're like going into the Holy of Holies, the most deepest part of the soul. When we're busy, for example, walking in the street or running our organizations or businesses, so we're not investing our deepest part of ourselves. We're investing our minds, our hearts. The only place you really, so to speak, literally both physically naked, but also spiritually naked, is when you are letting go of all your defenses, allowing yourself to be vulnerable with another human being. You're going into a place that is as pure as the Holy of Holies. So it's like the purest experience you can have, connecting. As we know, real intimacy is also joining and uniting with the divine. It's like intimacy with the divine. And as such, it becomes a force that is able to actually bear fruit, which is children. That's also why it could also have that negative impact. But here's the question. Being, as you put it, we are bodies and souls. The tug and the seduction and the power of materialism is so strong that even someone who is spiritual, when they're in a so-called, their sexual drive is alive and their hormones are very active, How do you create that balance between the spirit and the, you know, our minds tell us do things with a discipline and so on. But the sexual drive is so powerful that though it does need the soul, how does one really create such a discipline in their lives? How would you answer that?
So look, I think all of Judaism, I don't know, all is too strong of a word. So much of our mitzvot is exactly about creating that balance, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu understood, or he created us in a way that it could potentially be a struggle. And so many of our mitzvot are about spiritualizing our physicality, right? If we step away from sexuality for a moment, so we're allowed to eat so that there's like a moment of hesitation or a moment of commitment and connection to our spiritual side when we do it. Truth is, my favorite mitzvah actually, that as a woman, is the mitzvah of challah, where the Sefer Chinuch explains that the reason Hashem made giving challah a mitzvah is because by definition we have to provide for our families. So we're going to be baking bread. I guess this was in ancient times. Nowadays, maybe we buy it sometimes, but we're going to be baking bread. So let me make a mitzvah part of that baking bread. And then every time you provide for your family physically, you are at the same time intertwined providing for your family spiritually. So that is something that we're trained to from a young age. When a 3-year-old wants a chocolate bar and you say, you can't have that right now because you're fleishik, you have to wait until you're milchik, we're learning to kind of hone our ability to have some level of self-control. And it's definitely work, and it's definitely not simple. But the message from the Torah is very clear that we have the capacity, our guf and our nefesh are intertwined, and our nefesh, the capacity to be in charge of our guf. And that is the work of all human beings, right? We're always trying to manage our physical selves in all sorts of different ways. And I think that the Torah is pretty clear that it's possible. We live in a world that, and some of it has to do with context, and some of it has to do with education, right? Where you're told you're a sexual being and you're going to be a sinner and there's nothing to do, or you're a sexual being, just enjoy your sexuality and use your sexual powers. So then I'm going to think about that. And where I'm taught that my sexuality is powerful and beautiful, but it belongs in an intimate space between two people and not selling cars and not marketing other things, then I will see it in that context. So a lot does have to do with our expectations and how we're educating about that force power. Clearly, the Yetzer is a Yetzer for tremendous good, but it's powerful. So we have to learn to channel it.
Look, an additional challenge is also that the prevalent view on sexuality in the Western world, at least, is one of like a necessary evil coming from the original sin. It's very different than the Jewish view that sexuality, as you pointed out clearly, Nachmanides, the Ramban has a very powerful letter saying how sexuality and intimacy is not something that is ugly or despicable or, as I said, a necessary evil. He was clearly negating the view of the Christian view where sexuality is seen as a necessary evil, but it's affected all minds and our whole mass society and media. So we're dealing with, number one, is that wrong perception, as well as the fact that people just have as a result, some unhealthy shame. Instead of understanding it as the most sacred thing you can do, it's like an unhealthy shame. And finally, I would say, there's also the compartmentalization. People think sexuality is only about actually the sexual act, when in truth, intimacy in Judaism is 24/7. You are intimate all the time with your spouse, even if you're not physically together, because it's about a relationship of two souls connecting in two bodies. And when you understand it as that, it's not just relegated to an act, which is so much the focus today in the Western world on sexual techniques and methods, instead of a fully true relationship. You know, as two souls connecting in a way that is just bonds them and allows them to experience a transcendence that they can never experience on their own. And I think that's a vital component. You know, I like to put it this way: love in Judaism is a noun. It's a state of being. It's not just a verb and an act.
Well, it's definitely both, because you have to invest in love in order for love to stay alive and to grow and to be created. And if you want to talk about, well, let me just back off a minute. I absolutely agree. I think there's like quite a lot of research about how strongly the Christian ethic became part of the Jewish ethic when it really isn't a Jewish ethic. And certainly part of the work that I try and do when I educate children and adults is to change that. Really sees sexuality as positive, as we've said. It's kadosh. When in the right context, it's holy. No one else said that. As you said, it was a necessary evil in order to have children, and that's absolutely not the way Judaism sees it. Judaism, in other words, we are, couples are sexually active when they're pregnant, when they're not able to have children. It's clearly part of. It's called devek, which is also glue. It's part of what connects two people in a very, very deep way. It is powerful and needs to be used that way. And there's a lot of re-educating that we have to do around sexuality in our communities. I mean, both for our children and sometimes for our adults, because as you say, so often it's like part of that other world, that goyisha world, that world that doesn't behave correctly, and it's sad that it should be relegated to that space. And we need to help our, if you tell your students, sometimes I put on the board for students the word Judaism and the word sexuality, and I ask them to brainstorm connections, and they look at me and say there are no connections.
Wow.
And then I know that we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and there's also that element of people feeling guilty when they have pleasure, because they think this is some type of hedonistic pleasure. When we know in Judaism, when it's done the right way, in the sacred way, pleasure is part of God's plan.
Not just part of God's plan. I come back. The first tzivui, the first commandment, God's the Polish grandmother, right? Eat. I made food for you. I want you to enjoy it. That's the first words that HaKadosh Baruch Hu instructs us. So clearly pleasure is an important part, as long as it's boundaried.
I'll take it even a step further. When you read the chapters in the Torah about when Moshe Rabbeinu speaks to God, when he's up on the mountain, or in general, even in the Mishkan, in the sanctuary, the words used in the Torah are very intimate words. The word yud means intimacy. So in other words, even referring to God, even though we have to understand it more metaphorically, not physically, but the idea that God wanted to be intimate. And they have this conversation as like two intimate partners. And Maimonides actually says that the book of Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs, which is like a romantic story, is actually is a story of the love of God and the people. So you see from that it's not just a human thing. It's actually about learning how to be intimate with God. Now, again, this obviously has to be understood not in the sexual, literal sense of the word, but the idea of connection, as you said, davak, connection, dveikut, and attachment. So in that context, if I may ask, let me just reintroduce. I say I'm here to Simon Jacobson having this wonderful conversation with Dr. Yocheved Debow about intimacy and sexuality in our times and how we can communicate. So I think maybe we should carry this conversation, and I want to definitely go to Amazon or Katav, and I believe on our site as well, meaningfullife.com. And Dr. Debow's book is talking about intimacy and sexuality, a traditional guide for the Jewish parent, which addresses something that is really extremely necessary. I want to talk about this in the next segment, which is the fact is that so little talk. I mean, when I went to yeshiva in school, and I know my own children, I know my family and friends and so on, sexuality is simply taboo. You just don't talk about it. Now, I'm not suggesting we have to start talking about it in a way that has to be done modestly, but what it does is it lets children develop their own theories about it, which doesn't come from good places, from friends, from the street, from the media, and we're not taking a proactive approach. So by the time children turn into adults, they have all kinds of distorted views on the topic. So, let's take, after we've discussed the overview of it, how would you, what just even practical steps, let's start with parents, and then we're going to move to children, of how do we begin to even, as you said, undo, number one, the distortions, and most importantly, how do we educate and actually give them the right ideas about it? We talked about the spirituality of it, the soul of it, but like maybe spell it out in type of steps that you use in your work and you capture in your book so well.
Okay, so first I come back to something you said, because we have to be careful when we move into a space where we do talk about sexuality, to not overtalk, exactly as you said. In other words, tzniut is a value for all of us. It's definitely a deep Jewish value. I think it's sometimes used as an excuse to not talk, and I want to kind of separate it and say that from my point of view, not talking to me is actually anti-tzniut, because then what you end up with is that the only place our children are going to learn about that. They're not going to not learn about sexuality. That isn't an option nowadays.
Right.
I mean, I would argue that it probably never was an option, and it's not a good option because children should know about what's going on in their bodies. But let's say if we're talking about for those people who see it as b'diavad, they prefer not to talk. But what are you going to do? If you
let me just translate b'diavad. B'diavad
Sure.
means like not
like ideal.
No choice. Not in the way that we initially. It's like when I have no choice.
I prefer not to talk, but right. I prefer not to talk, but since we live in a world in which there's so much information out there, I better get my information out there. So if we don't take ownership of the messages, then our children will be 100% educated by the media, which is antithetical to so many of our values. So for me, talking comes from a place of tzniut, comes from a place of wanting to place it in the right context. And therefore I see it sort of as, and part of what I try and model, certainly part of what I write about in my book, is I think you can talk about almost anything in a way that is modest, that is tzniut. It's a question of how you talk about it. It's not what you say. It's what you say and how you say it. But the topic itself shouldn't be taboo. And as soon as something is taboo, it becomes, first of all, much more interesting. What's forbidden, right, we want to know about, and secret. And then, I often ask my students, or sometimes parents I speak to, how did you know that you weren't allowed to ask your parents anything about sexuality, even though they never talked about it, right? How do we pass messages on that this is something you can't talk about? Because as parents, we want to make sure we don't give those messages, right? How did I know I couldn't ask? And I don't want to create a home in which there are things that my children can't ask me. And maybe I'll say, that's a great question. I don't think you're old enough to know about it sometimes. Or maybe I'll say, this is the answer I'm ready to give you now. But I want my kids to feel that they can ask me anything and that they won't get into trouble for asking those questions. And that's, I think, something that all parents need to think about, honestly, in all areas. We want our children to come to us, and they will only come to us if we generate a sense that we're willing and interested and are going to give them honest, true answers. So that's certainly piece number one. If you ask about practical tips, we need to think about sort of what's the level of conversation that we create in our home, level of openness that passes a message on our children, that we're interested in talking to them. We're interested in hearing what they have to say, but I don't only want to lecture, I also want to listen, because kids want to be heard as much as they want to hear. And that I'm willing to engage you in any conversation that you're interested in having, and I'll be honest with you, I'll be open with you, whatever I tell you will be truthful, which doesn't mean I have to tell you everything. Again, I can choose what it is I say, but whatever I say is honest. If I tell my children that, the baby comes from the stork that delivered it to the hospital, the day they find out that's not true, they're never coming to ask me a question again. And if I say something about where babies come from that's very minimal, there's an egg and there's a sperm, and when they meet, a baby's born, and maybe that satisfies my 5-year-old, and when my 7-year-old comes back and says, but wait, hold on a second, how do they meet? I come up with a different level of answer, then they'll keep coming to me to ask more questions. So it's creating a safe, honest space for conversation that's respectful around these questions and these issues. And you know what? It starts with my learning to be comfortable as a parent talking about these issues. Exactly as you said, if I'm uncomfortable, then I pass on any message, I pass on a message of discomfort. So there's work that we have to do as parents, and that takes time sometimes, and maybe takes a playful date with a with a husband. It's something that we could do together, practicing talking about it and role playing, because we need to reach a certain level of comfort in order that when our children ask that we don't totally squirm and get uncomfortable. Even though sometimes I think that I can turn to my child and say, you can see this is that. In other words, it's important to use ourselves as a tool. I can say, you see, I'm blushing because this is uncomfortable for me, because no one talked to me. But I really want to make sure that you don't have that experience, because it wasn't comfortable for me. So even though it's a little hard, I'm going to push through. And actually nowadays, I feel like sometimes that's a more important message than anything we say, because in a world in which kids do a lot of communicating with screen and kind of run away from things that are uncomfortable, a parent turning to a child and saying, this is uncomfortable for me, but we're still going to talk about it because it's important, is a really important message in communication.
Absolutely. I would add, well, very well said, and I appreciate that very much so. For parents, first of all, I think also, besides suggestion you made, a play date, so to speak, and play it out and speak about it. Also to read about it. I think adults need to be re-educated. I'm talking specifically even religious and the frum world. They need to be educated about it because they also carry the shame and the guilt and don't talk about it and don't think about it. So of course you're not going to be able to communicate with your child about something you're so self-conscious about. And I can't tell you, especially, I mean, I don't know as much by women, but men in the frum world, the guilt and the shame is so deep, because it goes back to their first distorted ways when they formulated what this is. Most people learn about sexuality simply because of an urge or something that just happens to their bodies, and there's no one to talk to because teachers won't speak about it and parents won't speak about it. I want to just add one more thing. I think you said the word secret. You know, I feel and find that that there's a very big difference between a secret and privacy. You know, secret right away connotes there's something to hide. It could even be something ugly, like you cover up something that is a crime. Where privacy, which is really like another word for intimacy, is some things are not meant to be done in the street. That doesn't mean because it's ugly, or it could be actually most beautiful. I go back to the analogy I used before, Holy of Holies. We cover up the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh Kadoshim, not because it's ugly. Actually, it's the purest place on earth, because the world is too crass and insensitive that the things that are most precious need to be covered. I did once a workshop for children, and tell me what you think. You're definitely a bigger expert than I am. But I said to them, that's exactly the case. Like when you, for example, when there's surgery, God forbid, and you open up the internal organs, you need a lot of sterilization because they're very sensitive. You know, bacteria and infection always will gravitate toward the places where there's most vitality. So the fact that we cover up certain parts of our body is not because we're ashamed of it or it's ugly, is because it's so beautiful and so powerful that it needs to be kept protected, so to speak. And it's just a way of explaining, that's called the sexual organs and so on, that is reserved for the day you will be married and when you will have children. And you'll be able to bring life into this world, not because it's ugly or something to be ashamed or guilty about. How do you address that when it comes to the guilt and shame and that, like, you know, the giggling, the awkwardness, the discomfort around this topic?
I certainly agree with you on the private and secret. I actually read about that quite a bit, and also about the Holy of Holies for sure. I we have to have a balance of a little bit of humor and a little bit of acceptance and a little bit of like pushing through, right? So let's all giggle and see that it's uncomfortable and admit that it's uncomfortable. Okay, now we're going to say, in a way that you're saying, when you're so intimate, it's a little bit uncomfortable to talk about things that are so personal and private. We worry that our children will maybe be thinking about us in inappropriate ways, which is not true, but it's one of the fears that.
Yeah, I'm speaking here with Dr. Yocheved Debow, rather, and who's the author of Talking About Intimacy and Sexuality, a traditional guide for the Jewish parent. Highly recommended book. And I'll tell you the truth, on a topic like this, you can almost go on for hours. There's so much to say. Really been very insightful. I just wanted to touch upon, I thought that just to fill the picture a bit, I find as well, in my own experience, that many times, and this is not just about sexuality, it's about bullying or about other stuff, children want to be liked. They want friendship. They want companionship. They want to be popular. And very often, it's about their own seeking validation and confidence. So that's why you'll find a person who has less confidence and less validation is more vulnerable to, I don't want to just say a predator, but even to friends and to others who may take advantage of them. So the more you can infuse your child with that sense of confidence in yourself and that you're worthy and not, you can't just be used because it makes you, because someone is trying to make you, so you'll be more popular or you'll be more liked. That idea of confidence that comes from within, I find, even though it's more like preventive and preemptive, but it goes a long way into a child feeling, yes, you have a right, therefore, to come speak to me as a parent if something inappropriate has happened or any lines have been crossed. That idea of building that confidence in yourself, and therefore in the sanctity of your body and in your private places, parts, and so on. Wanted to add that into the equation. I think also parents who are so harried and rushed because they're busy at work and trying to provide and maybe have other children don't always have the patience and the time and the sensitivity necessary to hear your children. And hearing your child's call is not just when they speak. It's even, as you said, mentioned before, it's even the invisible messages they give us, the body language, not just our body language to them, but their body language to us, to just pick up. If your child is going through something, you could see this in the change of some of their habits, the way they're eating, their diets, and so on. To be really open, like you have to have your antenna very sharp with children and really be there for them, because that's often what happens when you're busy. You're just distracted, and you try to find quick fix, like Band-Aid solutions. Well, I will say this, if I may, that if your message and your methods get out there, I'm totally confident that you will make a real change in improving the situation. So I want to thank you, Dr. Yocheved Debow. I really, really appreciate it. I know we touched the tip of the iceberg, but I think it was quite insightful. I myself have learned quite a few things. I really want to thank you. And there's no question, it's the engine room of life itself, as you put it, the divine image, each one of us was created in the divine image, and there's no more place that it reflected most in than intimacy. Our intimacy is going to always reflect on the standard of our lives and what we're teaching our children and how the next generation will be educated and brought up. So this is not a small matter. That lies at the heart of the very purpose and mission of our lives. So I want to thank you all for listening. This has been a really enlightening conversation. I thank you again, Dr. Yocheved, and we should only celebrate as we're going into the new year. Everyone should have a ksiv v'chsima tova, a blessed year, and take our responsibility and gift as a sacred responsibility in bringing up children in the purest possible way, so they're armed with an arsenal of everything they need to be able to build their own lives and their own personal and intimate lives in the best possible way, and be a light to everyone else around them. Thank you again, and thank everyone. Thank you.